Pontiac's Rebellion, or really what we're going to be looking at here, is the direct aftermath of the French and Indian War. So, over the course of the 18th century, we have been seeing, and we're going to see this continue on, basically these British colonists who are American colonists now have basically been developing their own sense of identity as Americans and not just British colonists. So now I'm going to start referring to them as American colonists. Understand they're still British civilians at this time, but they're starting to have this kind of separate identity within the British identity. Keep in mind, at this point, they've largely been governing themselves through their own legislatures, and they really see themselves as enjoying like all the rights of any kind of British subject would have anywhere. So the thing is, in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, British officials are going to have several different issues. One big thing is that they have this burdensome debt, as well as they have this vastly increased territory that they have to administer over. And so we're going to see, because of this, British officials are basically going to attempt to change the way that they had previously governed the colonies. And we're going to eventually see that they're actually going to try to impose for the first time like direct taxes on the colonists. Now the thing is, this new course is ultimately a disaster for the British side. And we have to keep in mind, they have several different problems besides the debt. Now, some of these are more traditional European enemy issues. For instance, we do know that at this point in time, you see in the top right-hand corner of that map on the right side, the French actually own 2 islands along the North American coast. And then on top of that, the British have, recently acquired all these previously French territories. And there's this question, are they going to be unruly? Are they going to be disloyal to the British Empire? And then, of course, Spain has a significant presence on the North American mainland. Now, the British actually weren't too concerned about like Louisiana all the way to California and everything. What they were really more worried about was like protecting and controlling the colonies, but simultaneously doing this inexpensively, which becomes an issue. And then on top of that, how should they administer the new territories? On top of that, another issue is what do they do about Indian resistance in now the lands that they are claiming for themselves? And, rein in the seemingly out of control colonists. So the thing is, permitting these new areas that the British have acquired to have their own assemblies, well, it seems inadvisable, but it's also really unavoidable. What else are you going to do? But the British really wanted to avoid some of the unruliness that they see going on in the American colonies at this time. They also wanted to roll back the power of these old colonial assemblies. The thing is, during the French and Indian War, the British really had to work with the American colonial governments and everything in order to effectively wage war. But now the war is over. And so now it's like we can crack down and really tell them who is boss, which would be, the British Parliament, according to that. And so one of the things that they put forward is going to be the Proclamation of 1763. This had a few things that it did. The first one is that it basically established civilian governments in East and West Florida. So, bam. But the big thing that it did is it forbade white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains or west of these proclamation lines. And you can even see that on your map where that line would be. The idea behind this is twofold. On one hand, it's about keeping white settlers and Native Americans apart. And if we keep them apart, there's less likely going to be conflicts over in the American colonies. The second part, though, is to keep basically the American colonists closer to the coast, where it's going to be easier to control them in the future. So it's looking at external problems as well as internal issues. The other decision the British made at this time was to keep a substantial body of troops stationed in America even during peacetime. Originally, they planned for about 10,000. The thing is, both of these are not the best ideas. It's great in theory, but in practice does not work out too well. The thing is, the whole proclamation line of 1763, it provokes a lot of resentment because it basically threatens to deprive a lot of settlers that were in these, rapidly developing colonies. It deprives them of potential land for them to use in the future and that they want. And a lot of colonists are basically going to just ignore this proclamation and move further west all the same. The other issue with the troops is that, first of all, someone has to pay for the troops. And eventually we're going to see this through measures like the Quartering Acts that would require colonial assemblies to provide like barracks, as well as like certain other kinds of supplies for these soldiers. The other problem with these troops is that it's just alarming. There's a huge distrust at this time of standing armies. There's this question, are these troops stationed here to protect the American people from like Native American raids, or are they here to coerce the American, who are technically British, civilians into, doing the British Empire's bidding? The thing is, even if the British troops had done a really great job protecting the colonists from like Native Americans and everything like that, there probably still would have been objections to them being stationed, especially during peacetime. But as it was, there were still conflicts with the Native Americans. And in fact, we need to look at that. The thing is, with the end of the French and Indian War, if you looked on that map, there's not really a lot of land. There isn't land being claimed for Native settlements. The thing is, officials no longer need Native Americans as allies for military help or any kind of neutrality to play them off against other nations. They are superfluous allies at this point. And so this means that Native Americans have basically lost their former ability to protect themselves by any means short of military resistance. And this is what's going to lead to Pontiac's rebellion. Keep in mind, the proclamation line occurs before this happens. So on some level, it was meant to try to prevent Pontiac's rebellion from occurring. But there you go. What happens also in 1763, though, is that the Indians of the Great Lake region and the Ohio Valley region are very fearful that the British wanted to, exterminate them all and take their lands. Plus, they're just dealing with a lot of contempt from like British traders and officials. So what this does is it really basically inspires several different Native American groups to come together, and they unite behind an effort to resist the British. But also there's a second part to this. It's not just a military endeavor. It's an endeavor to revitalize Indian cultures. They would urge Indians to, reject European goods and European wars, but then they also do things like then Native Americans would attack British forces or American forces, really American settlers, all the way from the Great Lake region down to Virginia, starting in 1763. This goes on until about 1766. During negotiations, basically the Native Americans in charge of this area would insist that, just because the British controlled the French forts in this region doesn't mean that they own the territory, because the French had really just been tenants of the land that the Native Americans themselves owned. In the end, though, we're going to see that the British are going to force Indians to basically give up portions of their territory for compensation and guarantees that like traditional hunting grounds would remain theirs. These are promises that we'll later see how they aren't necessarily going to stay in place. More than anything else, we're seeing that more and more American settlers are still moving west. They're encroaching on Native American land because they are so land hungry. So I ask you this question as part of your journal. True or false? Pontiac's rebellion caused the proclamation of 1763. Is this true? Is this false? Go answer the journal and see if you are correct.